All right. I think everything is good and we should be live now. Hi everyone. Thank you for coming and listening to this conversation with us tonight. For the newcomers, my name is Meline. I'm Idoni's founder. We're an international community of journalists and agents of change working on topics related to conflict, whether it is social or armed conflict. And we want to make journalism on these topics more inclusive, more constructive, and solution oriented. So once a month, we organize events during which we invite really interesting people like Dina and Tina that I will introduce in a minute. And today we'll be talking about how to produce solution stories when reporting from conflict, how to find them, how to talk about them, and this a bit more in detail. Before I introduce our guests, I just want to talk about Marina and Charlotte. Girls, can you? Hi. And there are two volunteers working with Idoni. They will make sure that everything goes smoothly today. So if you have a question or problem, just put it in the comments and they'll talk to you and make sure you have a good time. And at the end, we'll save a bit of time for questions. They will be the one sharing the questions with us. All right, thank you. So today with us we have Dina Aboughazala, founder of EGAB, and Tina Rosenberg, co-founder of the Solution Journalism Network. Both of them journalists and solution journalism experts. So I think you're better than me to introduce yourselves. So maybe Dina, can you tell us about your experience as a journalist? What's it been and what you focus on, please?
Thanks, Meline. My name is Dina. I worked for the BBC for 14 years before leaving to establish EGAP, which is a media startup that connects reputable media outlets with solution journalism stories produced by local journalists from across the Middle East and Africa. Before establishing EGAP, I was a Middle East focused journalist, and then I came across solution journalism around 2016 during my time at the BBC, and I fell in love. It was love at first sight. And then I thought I'll take this love and build something bigger with it. And this is how EGAP came into being.
All right. Tina, can you tell us a bit about you, please?
Sure. Thank you. First of all, congratulations, Meline, on starting Idoni. It's much needed, and we're thrilled you're with us. And Dina, congrats on your extraordinary and very difficult work at EGAB. You've made a huge difference to reporting and journalism in the Middle East and Africa, and really, we're excited about the work you do. So I am a co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network, which began and before that, I worked mainly for the New York Times, although before that, I was a freelancer writing books and magazine articles.
So you founded in the Solution Journalism Network in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. And at that time, it was not a topic that was so much talked about. Now you can see it in many conferences, all this. So can you tell us a bit about the process? Like, how did you ended up doing this when you were kind of the only ones really talking about such a broad scale, let's say?
Well, first of all, many people had practiced solutions journalism before we arrived. They didn't have a name for it necessarily. To teaching it and a name and classification and do research around it, etc. But it existed before. We didn't invent it at all. And then we also, I think, were beneficiaries of the adage, never let a crisis go to waste. I mean, as you know, and as every journalist knows, journalism is going through twin crises, the economic crisis and the existential crisis. And so a very normally defensive profession is open to new ideas in a way that it would not have been in the past. So I think those two things helped. Also, of course, it's a great idea.
It is. I'm sorry, Tina, I don't think your connection is really good. You're freezing a little bit, so maybe we'll ask you to repeat yourself sometimes. Tina, your organization
Sorry
is,
about that. Yes.
it's okay, don't worry. Dina, your organization is much younger. It's doing an also very important job, but much younger. Can you also tell us, so you fell in love, but how did you come, to this idea, and tell us more also a bit what it is exactly? What do you do at
Oh,
your
sure.
organization?
Sure. Yeah, and yes, we are much younger. We're actually like the students of the Solution Journalism Network, so we do not compare. We're a completely different level. I myself was a fellow of the elite fellow of the Solution Journalism
In our
Network, so I
first
learned from
class.
them.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And it was a
So yeah.
pioneer. Yep.
Exactly. Just to establish this, I do not compare to Tina. Tina is an expert. I'm her mentee, let's say, a student of the Solution Journalism Network. Just to go back, so yes, for me, I think, yeah, I agree with Tina that many people must have practiced journalism before the term was coined, and I would say I am one of these people who did things, but I wouldn't say that it was the correct approach of social journalism, but it's like in essence, and what I wanted to achieve is something. I practiced something similar to solution journalism before coming across the term officially. And here is the importance of what the Solution Journalism Network did, because when you have a framework, it makes the work much more. It improves the outcome, right? You have a better, better quality journalism when you have a framework, because you've seen a lot of solution journalism imposters. So you'd have people think, oh, it's us as journalists who need to come up with ideas, and that's great, but that's called opinion pieces. And then you also have people who would, focus on the person rather than solution. So I think having a concrete framework is great. And I was lucky that when I came across the term, this framework already existed. So I came across solution journalism and actually there was a lecture or a workshop that was given by the BBC around 2016, and the BBC was championing the solution-focused journalism, which they were trying to find a way between the constructive journalism approach and the solution journalism approach, which they both aim to achieve the same results and goals, but have slightly different approaches. And the BBC wanted to come up with something in the middle. And yes, so this is how as I said, I came across it. And I, as someone from the Middle East, I'm Egyptian, and I was a Middle East focused journalist. I thought this is something that we really need in my region. And also as Egyptian, I belong to both regions. I belong to the Middle East and Africa. And these two regions mostly in the news for all the negative reasons. I know nowadays is an exception because of the World Cup in Qatar. So now if you ask people in the Middle East, they will say, oh, the World Cup, Qatar, or Morocco, it's the miracle of the World Cup, which is great. But before, at that time, we didn't have this. So if you say the Middle East, and 2016, this is like the peak of ISIS, it will be terrorism. And of course, Africa, unfortunately, would be like poverty, or Boko Haram, which is also terrorism. So you keep moving around three themes. It's like human rights violations, terrorism, poverty, which again, we do not say that these things do not exist, but they are not the whole story. They are just part of the story, right? That's why I was adamant on pursuing this genre of journalism, because I thought that's what it's needed. Because I personally also, as someone who lived abroad for a while, I've encountered this personally when I get asked very stereotypical questions like, oh, can you walk like this in Cairo, i.e. not covered, or stuff like this, like just reinforces the stereotypes. And it goes back to the media, right? Because you can't blame the people for having stereotypes. If this is the same story, the media keeps showing a single story, the single narrative about the oppression of women in the Middle East, etc., etc. Which again, we do not say that this does not happen, but when I tell people a country like Egypt is huge, and you can see the whole spectrum of people wholly covered from head to toe, and that's their choice. There are people who are, many people also, this is their choice, and women who wear bikini in the North Coast. So you have the whole spectrum, but you don't see the whole spectrum in the media.
And so with EGAP, like, what is it that you actually do? Like,
okay,
daily?
so Sorry.
No. That was my next question, so it's fine. We go in an order or another. Don't worry.
Uh, yes. So what we do is, again, as you mentioned, this is a relatively new genre. And also it started when it became coined, whether by the Solution Journalism Network in the US or the Constructive Institute in Denmark. It was mainly in the West, right? And it's remained there. So it came really late to the Middle East. So actually, when I started IGAB, still many people would say, What's solution journalism? It wasn't. It's becoming more known now, and I like to believe that we had a role in this at IGAB. So what we did, there are two things here. So first, we're teaching journalists and raising awareness and educating and training journalists on the practice of solution journalism, the proper practice of solution journalism, especially that there is unfortunately scarcity in the learning material in Arabic, for example. So that also is a barrier for many journals from the Middle East to practice this genre. So this is something. The other thing is that we believe in completing the cycle that the best way of learning is learning by doing. So if you just get people and make them sit in workshops, I don't know, for a week or even months, like there is a limit to what they learn unless they can actually apply it. And that's the best way of learning is by doing and receiving feedback. So this is the second part of IGAB, is that we help journalists, we empower, we enable them to get published in international media. So they practice that what they learned, and at the same time they get paid, because that's very important. And they build their CVs as well. So we enhance their career prospects. So we help the individual journalists learn a new genre, which helps them stand out in the crowd in a very busy market. You have all these freelancers. We keep pitching the same stories. So when you get a new angle, solution journalism, it helps them also their pitch to stand out of the crowd. And at the same time, they, as I said, by getting these bylines, we enhance their career prospects so that in a year or two, depending on how fast they learn, they can then fly on their own. This is our ultimate goal. And at the same time, overall, the impact of this whole process is that we are also feeding international media a different kind of stories about the Middle East Africa that changes the narrative and kind of like challenge the dominant narratives around these two regions.
Which is, we're gonna come back to this in a minute. But before that, like Tina, so you're also teaching with the Solution Journalism Network at a much more international level. Can you tell us about this? Like, do organizations accept, for their journalists to be teaching, like to be taught solution journalism? Like, how do they accept a new topic?
Oh, it's very accepted now. We have not had a problem with that. It occurs to me, Milene, that I haven't said what solutions journalism actually is.
I was gonna say, and then because you're teaching, can you tell us, like in your
resume,
what is solution journalism?
It is rigorous reporting on how people are trying to respond to problems. It is. I did a workshop this morning for some journalists around the world, and one of them had a very interesting way of defining it. It's you have 10 hospitals in your area, and 9 of them have not met the regional standards for something, whatever. So normally you would write about that, but why not write about the one that did and see what they did that worked? How did they do it? And what can we learn? I know my internet is waving in and out, I'm sorry. It looks at how people are responding to problems and covers that not as celebrating it, but as rigorous reporting. What works about it? What doesn't work about it? What can we learn from it? What's the evidence of what do we know about how well it works and doesn't work?
And so, how would you, as a reader, recognize a solution story if you read one or if you see one in the news?
It really depends on what kind of story it is. If it's a story about a widely known problem, and most solution stories are, people are tired of reading about the problem and they tune out. We know that by far the biggest reason people feel hopeless and disempowered. So you try something new and you write a solution story. And so you might start with an anecdote or two about something that's happening in the program you're covering. Maybe you would write about sort of let's say you were writing about a neighborhood program that was expanding mental health care. So you might look at a client of that program who had not been able to get mental health care in the past and was able to get it, and the difference that has made in that person's life. Then you would go back and talk about how large a problem it is that people don't have access to mental health care. You can give more context, talk about other ways, just a paragraph or two other ways that people are trying to solve that problem. And then the rest of the story is you can talk about what this group is doing, what they're doing that makes them newsworthy. Usually it's because they're doing something different that others are not. So that's focus on that. Perhaps they have decided it's not only free, but it comes to you. It's a mobile van. So you might talk about that and then describe more about how they did this and how well the program works. What did the evidence say about how many people it served, about the outcomes, if there is evidence? And if there's not a lot of evidence, as there tend not to be in very new programs, say that. You know, this is a program people are excited about, but we don't know for sure that it works. There's not a lot of evidence. Go back and tell more about the stories of the people at the clinic, the staff and the clients. So I would say that's a pretty standard template for a 1,000-word solution story.
All right. So at Idoni, we focus a bit on social and armed conflict because we think that, you can learn a lot about a society, cultures through, their conflict, and conflict also have a great influence on society. They shape them and on culture and such. So I think that's why we think it's very important to have the best covering we can. And it's true, as you mentioned, Dina, that sometimes, especially, let's say in Africa and the Middle East, but it's true for other reasons. Very often Latin America is just a big gang problem if you're media from the Europe and North America. Like, it's getting a bit better, but it's still this kind of representation. So why is it important, especially in those regions, that we tend to stereotype as European, North American journalists? And why is it important, especially there, to have this lens when covering conflict?
There are two elements here. So first, it's very important to have this solution lens in general when covering these regions, as I said, because when you just focus on one story or one theme, you lead to enhancing the stereotype here, right? You're entrenching the stereotypes so that, again, entire countries and entire regions are reduced to a single story of war, terrorism, or oppression. Okay, so that's a problem, because that's not true. That's yes, there might be a war in one of these countries or a few of these countries, but doesn't mean that the entire country is defined by just a war. That's just part of the story. So that's one why it's very important to tackle other stories as well. But if I'm going to zoom in my answer on why it's important when a country is witnessing conflict, to cover it also from a solution lens, I think there is, if we go back to the role of media, and if we go a little bit even further back, like what is a conflict, right? So conflict usually comes from, when you have groups of people or individuals, they have dissimilarities, right, in ideas, positions, opinions, right? This what leads to conflict. They reach a point where the gap is so huge that there seems that there's no prospect to find this middle ground or to find another solution. You could even argue that conflict in itself is an extreme expression of position or communication, a very violent, extreme way of communicating. So media in the traditional way, it's one, and I'm here speaking about traditional media first, like one of the main roles of media is to try to build this common ground. First, to educate each side of the opinions of the other side, right? To make sure that there is no misunderstanding, that each side really understands where the other side is coming from. That's in an ideal world, what media should how media should operate. Unfortunately, we don't see this, and most of the time we see actually polarizing media, or that. And I think also Tina would be better to explain the complicating the narrative theories, like how when you complicate the narrative rather than just simplifying things and say X said, Y said, and just because you presented the both opposing views, that you've done your job as a media. So this is just the basics of what media should do. But I would argue that even solution journalism takes a step further than just like bringing the ideas or the views closer, or making sure that each side of the conflict understands the views or the positions of the other side, is by showing all the parties involved in the conflict a way of solving this conflict through either what I love to call historical solution journalism, because many of the conflicts, I don't want to say all of them, but many of the conflicts that we're seeing nowadays, we've witnessed similar conflicts in the past, and they were resolved, some of them. So there are a lot of learnings that we could learn from similar historical conflicts. So again, I think this would be a very useful way, if like saying, oh, if there's a conflict over water, for example, well, these two countries had a similar conflict, and this is how they resolved it, and going through the 4 pillars. So Tina spoke about the definition for solution journalism and the framework, which I love, especially if you're starting on your journey of practicing solution journalism. It's very useful to just follow these 4 pillars of like looking at the response and looking at the evidence of how this response worked or not, and then looking at the insights, like what could we learn? Why did that solution work in this context? Is it related to, I don't know, certain natural resources? I don't know, other cultural prerequisites that were there, or it could be adapted to other communities as well. And the last thing is limitations, because as we all agree, there is nothing such as a perfect solution. So again, looking at the historical solutions and presenting it this way is very informative to people who are currently involved in a very similar conflict, because they can learn. So this is one. And also another way is to look at communities, like even nowadays, not just historical, like who are facing similar conflicts and how they resolved it. So we don't have really to look at like a few decades back, maybe last year or the year before, we had a community who experienced a similar conflict. So I think that's why it's very important to practice solution journalism, because I would argue that as journalists, we could have an even more active role in helping these communities find solutions by inspiring them through bringing them examples, like through rigorous journalism, of how similar conflicts were resolved either in the past or in other communities.
Thank you. I think that's a very good summaries. Tina, could you tell us more about this complicating the narrative theory, if people are interested? I know on your website you have a very good page describing how to do it and explaining, so I really encourage people to go check out your website. It's full of plenty of resources, but could you explain it to us, like how it works and why it's necessary, maybe linking it to conflict, like not only to polarize but actually tell all the stories?
Sure. Well, Dina mentioned that people generally don't know accurately how the other side thinks. And in fact, it's worse than that. It's people who read the news and consume the news know less about the news. Consuming the news actually gives you a misleading picture of how the other side thinks, because we as journalists tend to focus on the caricature of the other side. We collect the most outrageous statements from both sides and call it balance. And it gives an extremely distorted picture of society, because most people are not the extremes. The vast majority of people are in the middle. And yet people think that's not the case, because what they see in the media is only the extreme. So complicating the narrative is a way of covering polarizing issues in a way that depolarizes them. And one of them is, don't do that. Don't cover just the extremes and call it, that's what the other side thinks. Instead of going for inflammatory, people believe on the other side. and why they believe it, and get and interview them, seeking their true story and their meaning, not to caricature them, but to really understand them in a way where they would say afterwards, yes, you got me right. And you don't have to agree with them, but you're just presenting what it is that they feel and think and why. So that's really, in a nutshell, what complicating the narratives is. And I think I think Dina left out one thing that's very, very important in talking about why conflicts occur, and that is conflict entrepreneurs. And that can range from people on cable TV in the United States, like Tucker Carlson, on the relatively minor side, to Slobodan Milosevic and Adolf Hitler. I mean, people who deliberately want and a career. And usually they do that by whipping up a sentiment that says the other side is out to get us in some way. And it's a very important job for journalists not to play into that and to try and show what is really going on, and using complicating the narratives methods to do that. The other thing I would say about covering conflict with solutions journalism, which is a little different than complicating the narratives journalism, is that solutions is not a way to report on breaking news. You cannot cover a bombing in Ukraine using a solutions approach. What you can do is take a very small piece of a feature story in a war. For example, not have any electricity or heat. How is it that people on are there pockets where there were people on the Bosnian side and on the Serb side came together to do something together? These are by necessity going to be small stories, and they're not going to be stories of people who solved the problem. They're going to be really valiant efforts to solve a problem. And it is a part of a way to cover a war, to accompany the breaking news style that comes with, here's what happened in the war today. But it's very important to show that there are human beings there, and war is not necessarily all consuming for everyone, and people don't necessarily.
Wait, I'm sorry, we really missed your conclusion, the end of the sentence.
I am so sorry about this. Yeah, it's important to show that there are human beings there, and people don't necessarily lose their humanity in a war.
Very true. So, and thank you. You're leading directly to my next question. So, what would be the timeline? Because it's different as breaking news and reporting what's happening, and we have to say when there's bombs everywhere and it's chaos in the city. It's true. It's also part of what's happening, so we have to talk about it. So in the meantime, at the beginning would be finding the small stories of humanity in the middle of this. But would solution journalism then come a bit after when talking about conflict? Like, if I'm a journalist practicing this, when should I be looking for the solution and where?
I think you should start looking from the beginning, because there are things you're going to want to follow over time. You might not write about it right away, but you might want to check in with this hospital or school or football club with frequency and go back to them. And I think you can do these kinds of stories right away. You're not going to be misleading people into thinking that everything's fine in Ukraine by doing them. I don't think you have to worry about that. I think they're a very important part of covering a war, no matter what day it is.
We lost her again. Okay, hi. Yeah, we lost you at the end again, but I think we got the.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry. I think we got the idea. So maybe, Dina, with examples you've had or stories you worked on yourself, or the people that you're training and they're making great stories with you. So, like, what do we have to be on the lookout in a conflict situation? Because it seems messy and it might be a bit more difficult to see and to find solutions, or what could be a solution, those kind of humanity. So how do you look for them?
Sure. So I totally agree with what Tina said. Previously, when I was speaking about historical solutions, etc., I was looking more at the macro level if you're going to speak about solving the conflict as a whole.
Yeah.
But it's true, like you have to conflict is taking place. Okay, we're back. So I was just going to say that when I was speaking earlier about these historical solutions, etc., it was at the macro level. But exactly as Tina said, we have to always remember that when conflicts take place, they don't take place in a vacuum, right? They take place in countries, societies with communities made up of human beings. And as human beings, this is how we operate. We always try to find solutions. This is how we've managed as humanity to survive so far, and hopefully we will continue to last without killing the planet. But this is another conversation. The point is that so when a conflict happens, it's a disruption in the way things used to operate when it comes, for example, to education or to movement or whatever. So, for example, in Yemen, right, we've had this, we've produced several stories about all these initiatives that's been happening, especially with you having two governments and then one government not giving the salaries, and then you have the issue of teachers are not being paid in public schools. And then one of the stories were examples that how the Yemenis, the parents were banding together with support from the expats outside of the country to pay salaries for the teachers themselves out of their pockets to be able to sustain the education of their children. So again, this is not a sustainable solution, but it's a response.
Right,
and that's why the first pillar is a response, right? It's not a solution. And this is perhaps answers your question when you said when or where. I think the when depends on the solution, right? Because again, solution is not about the journalist coming up with a solution. As a journalist, you report what's happening on the ground. So as long as you're on the ground and you're having eyes on what's going on, the moment you hear of like, the people coming together, to, as I said, for example, there was also another story from Yemen about how animals shelters, about animals like in the middle of the war, and we have all these human victims. What's happening to the animals, right? So in the middle of the war, the group of people came together, vets, and to create, like, make sure that there are shelters for animals who are being abandoned and etc. in the middle of the war. So stuff like this. Once you hear of such a thing happening, and there is enough data or evidence that you can use to kind of like prove and show through your story whether the response is working or not, then it's the time. I would even argue that, as I said, yes, as we all agree, it's from the beginning. But even as conflict dwells on and on and on, solution journalism becomes even more important, because what happens is that people get used to it. So like I would argue, like when the Syrian war started, people were like, oh my God, what's going on? Now everyone's like seemed to have lost interest, right? And I think one of the way to engage the audience with the story is through the solution journalism, because then you put the people in these communities also in a different perspective, because under a different light, because when you're always portraying them as victims, unfortunately, after a while, people start, unfortunately, this is our human nature, like, oh, poor them, people living far away in Syria, while if you're, I don't know, in Europe, in the US, it's a very far away from you. But if you start producing a story about how women are coming up with solutions to period poverty, like with the war, with the sanctions, with everything, with the economic crisis, like the prices are going up and the income's going down. Like period poverty is a real problem in countries like Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. So how, when you read about women coming together and starting to come up with initiatives and how to solve this, how to counter this, or how to cope with this problem, it's suddenly when you're reading it, they're not victims anymore. they're actually, you have respect for them. You feel that, wow, these are women I would like to support. And we have real examples of this. So we actually did a story about period poverty in Syria. And afterwards, for the New Humanitarian, and the editor told us that she got contacted by a few international NGOs who asked to be able, if they can be connected with these women because they want to support them. And I think for me, that's a huge impact if we always speak about impact. So just, raising awareness and telling people who are willing to help that there are a group of women in Syria who are working on addressing this problem. And just by publishing this piece, others who are willing to help know about them, and they can help them. So it's also, again, ties into what Sina said. It shows that there are humans, there are real people who are living there. And at the same time, it's an opportunity to keep the people engaged with these long, it's a decade-long conflict, but without just repeating the same stories, by shedding a different light.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. Yeah, couldn't agree more. So one of the things when you cover conflict is that maybe, and I don't know, Tina or Dina, whoever wants can go and answer, but maybe the people who come up with solutions and put them into projects and things like this, they might be activists or social workers or people who put their life on the line to provide the solutions. Maybe the governments or the groups that they're fighting against are looking to fight them, and so safety of the sources is always first when you report. So how, like, two questions: how do you convince these people to let you tell the story and talk about the solution, and how do you protect them in this context?
I'm not sure you should convince them.
No, it's not the best word.
Yeah, I mean, they know if that'll put them in danger or not, and you can sometimes work out a way to not tell where they are or their names, but you can. I mean, people, I think, sometimes hope that more will come out of a journalistic story than actually does, and journalists are wrong when we mislead them in the service of furthering that false hope. It's great when people from overseas see a kindred spirit and a project and decide they're going to donate. It's kind of rare. It doesn't happen that often, and very often the story will not have anything to do with improving their lives. So it's got to be up to them.
It's like it could be.
I totally agree. In our case, if someone doesn't feel comfortable being named, we give them the right to be anonymous, of course, as long as the publication appears, or give them a pseudonym. Like this is always a guaranteed thing if they and if no one is forced. Exactly, it's like I have to agree. But I mean, in very honestly, we had this in very rare cases, and mainly if we're having a story related to sensitive topics like sexual assault, sexual harassment, stuff like this, and it's understandable that the victims wouldn't want to be named. But so far, we haven't had a situation where someone said, exactly, like what we do is that we encourage the journalists, and I think this is the very important thing, if hopefully freelance journalists are listening to us, is that many freelance journalists underestimate the amount of work needed at the pitching stage, right? They think, oh, I have this idea, and if it's commissioned, then I'll go and do more research. I think we struggle to a lot with our journalists is that to explain to them, well, unless you do very thorough research as if you're already commissioned to do the story, 90% your pitch will not be commissioned because it will be lacking a lot of crucial information. So this point, at this stage, that's when it's important for the journalist to already establish with the context, with the sources, whether they're willing to speak or not, because it will really increase also the chances of the pitch getting commissioned if he already or she already mentions in the pitch that already he has access to sources who are willing to speak. So it happened, I think, only once that after a journalist, in our case with IGAP, like a source agreed to speak to the journalist, that then they backed down and said, oh, I feel comfortable speaking about this. And what happened is that we just respected this. He even didn't want to be even anonymously being quoted. The journalists had to find a different source. I know it's a pain, but this is part of the job.
No, but I think it's interesting to talk about it because sometimes, especially when we have a parachute journalist, which is also a problem in itself, you want the story and you want to get it out, and you don't really remember that people stay when you go home, and might have a consequence. So like that's also why I wanted to make it really clear and to take time to talk about it. Which leads me to your community that you have with EGAP. It's mainly local journalists. So like, how does that help also to find a solution to create a relationship that maybe I wouldn't have if I will land tomorrow in whatever country that I've never been to? And
just to be very clear, I have a disclaimer. I'm very vocal against parachute journalism. I've even written an article about it. So I come from that stand. Just like many other people might be okay with it, I'm against it. Unless you're going to do work in collaboration with a local reporter who you're not going to name as a fixer. He will be a co-producer of the story with a joint byline and gets paid 50% of whatever you're going to make. Then it's called a co-production, and then you're welcome to parachute in the country as long as you're working with a local journalist. Other than this, for me, is exploitation of local journalists. Yes, that's part of why I created EGAP, by the way. There are many reasons why I created EGAP, but this is one of the reasons, is exactly to try to put an end to the exploitation of local journalists. So I personally, again, people might disagree with this, I believe locals are the best to tell their community stories. And for so long, we've heard of, oh, but when you're part of the story, you're not objective, right? That's why we need to have this foreign eye coming to report. But then this only applied to us in non-Western countries, because guess what? I was living in London during Brexit from 2015 to 2019, and I always turned on the BBC to find British people, British correspondents, informing me and others about Brexit. Not Egyptians, exactly. Exactly. I was waiting for someone to ask me. Like, I was there in London working for the BBC, and no one said, Dina, as an Egyptian, come and report on Brexit to make sure that we have an objective reporting.
Yes. Yeah.
Isn't that annoying? All these things, all these polarizing topics, we've heard Americans, right? Reporters reporting on it. So why do we trust Americans?
It really means that you threaten the dominant narrative. If you threaten the dominant narrative, you're not objective.
Exactly. And I mean, so this is the point. I mean, and I just want to say it out loud and clear that this argument, please, let's stop using it.
No, never.
It's not valid. It's invalid. So please don't. So this is the point. I personally believe that locals, as I said, if we're speaking about complicating the narrative, right, you need to understand the complexity. And I told you, I worked as a Middle East focused journalist for the BBC. That was wrong. I wrote pieces about Libya. I've never been to Libya. I wrote pieces about Iraq. I've never been to Iraq. This was wrong. That's not right, because I, as an Egyptian, like, I know we for example, the media likes to put Arabs in one lot. Oh my God, Egypt is completely different from Lebanon, from Syria. Yes, you can find some similarities, but the nuances are completely different. So if you want to really end up with a rigorous piece of reporting, you can't really do it without understanding all these nuances. Does this mean that foreigners cannot report on other countries? No, of course they can. Go to that country, stay in it for a while, learn the language. I always say this, and perhaps Tina have heard me before say it because I keep saying it a lot. Imagine if Russia or China sends a correspondent to London who doesn't speak English to report on Brexit. Would you trust their coverage? I always ask my British friends this, and the answer is straight no. They don't even think about it. And I immediately look at them like, this is exactly what you're doing to us. You send correspondents who don't know the language or understand the culture, and they stand in front of a camera as experts, and you believe whatever they tell you about our communities. So you end up with a very simplified, stereotypical coverage. So that's why it's important to have locals, because locals will understand the complexities. I mean, there are many layers and layers for things that it's very difficult to understand unless you're really living in that country and you've learned the language and you're not just relying on English sources, for example, in an Arabic speaking country. So that's why also that makes it easier, although there is other challenges that we can speak about later, is that for them to spot these solutions, local solutions, because they are aware, first, they are more aware of the problems in their communities. So for example, you or someone in Turkey or whatever might not be aware that this problem even exists in Egypt, but Egyptians are know of it, and that's why there are people who are coming up with solutions. So that's why for you as a foreigner, if you will never be able to spot this because you weren't aware of the presence of this problem as a start. So yes, so that's why when you have local journalists, you end up with stronger pieces. Again, you are able to discover new stories that otherwise would have remained hidden. But again, there's the caveat that these local reporters need to find the right guidance and training, of course, because also you have the problem of poor education, poor journalism industry in general, local journalism industry in these countries. So this is on other challenges.
It's a great comparative advantage for local journalists also. It's something you can pitch that only you can pitch. So
exactly.
Don't waste that.
Yeah.
That's great. Each time I present Idoni, as a community linking people like many like French, European journalists, because for now I've mainly pitched in Europe, and they're like, "Oh, so you're creating a fixer agency?" I'm like, "Oh no." And just the fact that you just said that, either we have a lot of work to do together, or I don't want to work with you. We're going to have to redefine some things before and power relationships. But that's another thing. Well, we only have like 10 minutes left. So before asking people if they have questions, if they don't, that's fine. I have more. Do you think it's more difficult to sell? So let's say you have a really good story that you did everything we just talked about. But to sell a story to like media outlets, because they only see the bombs, and we're fighting it and it's getting better, but we'll still have this kind of, if it bleeds, it leads. And people want to see, they don't want to see, but they're more attracted to cows and those kind of pictures. So have you encountered more difficulty to sell solution stories when talking about conflict? Or have you heard of, Tina?
Go ahead, Tina.
No, a good story is a good story. Sorry. Really, that's what matters. So this is what the editor sees. He doesn't see, solution journalism. Maybe there was like a couple of editors when we first started, was like, but then I think if you're presenting a solid story, again, the 4 pillars, and you have this unique story and you're presenting through the pitch that you've done the research, the editor will assess it as any story. So the criteria, is it a strong story or not? And I would even argue, especially from one part of the world, that when you pitch a solution journalism story, again, that increases your chances of standing out of the crowd, because the editor is seeing, as you said, like all these dozens of pitches of, again, terrorism, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly a story that they have never come across before. And I just mentioned one example. So for example, the first story from Libya in the Solution Journalism Tracker was one of IGAB's stories from Libya. It was about how Libya a program in Libya managed to double the number of female registered voters. The moment we pitched the story, it was commissioned right away, because again, Libya is all about fighting and all these things, and then suddenly you have something different.
If it bleeds, it leads is very that's not how it works especially not for feature stories. It may work for TV news covering fires and shootings, and it shouldn't, but it does. But for feature stories, especially for overseas and international stories, people crave the solution story. It's what makes them feel connected, what makes it real to them. yeah, I think it's a big advantage.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a question from Esther. If I'm sorry, I hope that's how you said. Yes. So thank you for this event. You're welcome. Come back anytime. Can we start only with solutions? What about if we see a problem and we start looking for a solution? If locally, can it work too? Who wants to answer?
I'll take that. Yes, Esther, either way. You can say, look, I have a feeling that there are schools that are operating in this area, even during wartime. I'm going to try and find one. Or you can come across a group that is doing something interesting and you start with the solution. Or you can use the positive deviant approach. For example, I was just talking to a reporter who covers the Middle East, Dina, and she said Morocco has the best record on solar panels. Let's look at how they did it and what other countries can learn from that. Use data to find the best performer and how they did it. And then how you structure it in the story also depends. New is, if everybody's sick of hearing about the problem, then yes, start with the solution. But if the problem in itself is new, then you start with the problem. You might not want a solution story first thing out. The problem is going to be in that story, but it probably wouldn't go first if that's the familiar part that people really are looking for something different first.
Yeah, okay. Right. Have you seen, so you mentioned, I think it was Dina, like that sometimes you've seen the impact of a solution story, and when you talked with the school and the teachers and people paying, and then the media has been in touch. So have you seen an impact that solution journalism can do, like with real life consequences? Or maybe you studied, Tina, you did a better study on the impact of solution journalism. Do you have something on conflict?
I'll just
Let me
mention
think
something
for a
very
minute while
quick.
Dina answers.
Yeah, I think the question of impact is very important, but I think sometimes, so yes, there was this story, period poverty in Syria, where the impact was like straight away. But this is an exception because I personally think that the impact happens over time. So the fact that many people think, oh, for an impact, it's like a story that gets published and then immediately there's a law, gets drafted, or a bill that gets passed, and then that's an impact. But we forget that impact takes time and it's an accumulative process. So maybe, yes, you've put a story here today and then someone else comes and builds on it, then, a few months or years, and then it builds this pressure for then law or changes to happen. So I think also we need to, I know that's tricky because we were very obsessed with assessing impact on the spot, and you can look at metrics that people like the engagement rate, how many people, how long people stayed on the story. So media outlets will use these as to kind of assess or gauge how well a story did, which is okay. But if you're looking at long-term impact, I would argue that we perhaps need to be more creative and look at ways to assess long-term impact. Because I think it's more, I would like to look at it as a pipeline rather than one story leads to this boom, big change.
I agree with that, Dina. And I think there's another way, though, that solution stories can have impact, and that is as part of investigating. The bad guys can dismiss your findings by saying, oh, well, this is an impossible problem and we're doing the best we can. But if you add a solution story that shows that 100 miles away, there's a place that's doing a lot better and they don't have any more resources than we do, then essentially you're taking a problem that was seen as unavoidable and you're making it seem like a problem that's that has no reason for being there. It's just, it should not be a problem because there's a solution for it. So I think a solution story adds impact to an investigative story. Again, though, as Dina says, it's rarely going to be overnight. It's more a long-term process.
Right. Couldn't agree more. All right, so the event, it's been 1 hour. So I think, except if you want to add anything else, Tina, Dina, something that you think it's interesting mentioning? But
I think you've done a great job of covering lots of different aspects of this complicated subject, Meline.
I'm trying. I do have one little question. So for people who are discovering solution journalism, whether it is in general or more centered, how to cover conflict with it, do you have any like resources that you use? Website? I mean, the solution journalism has a great tool to see what a solution story could be like. So maybe Tina, you can take a couple of minutes to tell us about this, because I really think people need to see that and read that tool. Like, it's great.
Yeah. I mean, as the Solutions Journalism Network, we don't do solutions journalism. We're not a news organization or a destination site, but we do collect solutions journalism that has been done by others. And a database called our Solutions Story Tracker. And I can put that URL as soon as I'm done talking. I'll put it in the chat. But it right now has about 14,000 stories in it. And it's human curated. We add more stories every day. And you can search by anything you can think of, by location, by region of the world, SDG, by issue area, by secret sauce, even what makes this, what's the insight here, what makes it work, by the news outlet, by the journalist, by platform, by length. So anything that you are interested in writing about, you can probably find a couple of great examples, all of which are vetted solutions journalism in the Solutions Story Tracker. And it is free and open to the public.
I'm just saying, Marina and Charlotte just put in the comments the links to AirGap, to the Solution Journalism Network, to the Twitter of Dina and Tina, if you ever want to see what they work on. And I don't know, maybe get in touch with them. But yeah, so you have all of this in. If you want to rewatch or to come back to some point, you can still come back on the YouTube page, and the event is there for anyone who was late or want to listen to it again just because you like us. I don't know. So Dina and Tina, please stay with me a few minutes more after we go off. But to anyone else, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did this conversation. And the next event is going to be on the 17th of January. And we will be talking with someone from Africa No Filter, and, talking about how people need to be able to tell their own stories and how it's important to diversify narratives. But if you follow us, I will be telling you much more in the following weeks. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening, day, morning, depending on where you are. And until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you.